In this video, we're going to be exploring some of the myths and facts about learning a new language. All right, so if you haven't already done so, you'll see these 6 statements on the page for today's class. So before watching this video, I want you to read through each of these statements and make a prediction for yourself about whether or not you think the statement is a myth or it is a fact. So do this now if you haven't already. Pause the video, read through them, make that decision, and then we'll watch together. And once you're done, go ahead and hit play. All right, so we're going to start with number 1. It is normal for a student learning in a new language to say nothing in that language for up to 6 months. This statement is a fact. So sometimes students are surprised by this because 6 months seems like an awfully long time for a student to say nothing. However, what we know from the research in second language acquisition is that most students who are learning a new language go through a silent period. A silent period can last as short as 5 minutes and can last up to 6 months. And during this silent period, it doesn't mean that the student is not learning and acquiring new understandings of language. They often start to develop receptive language abilities even before they're producing language. So they might be able to understand what someone is saying or understand some of what somebody is saying, especially if the person communicating is using visuals, gestures, or other ways of amplifying their message. But they might not be able to produce language at this point. And so here you can see the 5 stages of second language acquisition as developed by Krashen and Terrell in the 1980s. And these 5 stages have more or less remained the same through to today, to the research that is done today. So you see these different stages during that silent period. Students can typically point to things, they can act things out, they can match and label, and they might be able to respond yes and no by nodding or shaking their head. So they are still developing language, but the important takeaway here is that just because a student isn't speaking in the language and it's been a few months does not mean that they have a learning disability. It's a part of the process of learning a new language is the silent period, which again could be as short as a minute and as long as 6 months. And you see the rest of the stages here, and we'll talk more about the stages of second language acquisition later in this course. But you see then students move into early production, where they're producing 1 or 2 word responses, speech emergence, where they start speaking in fuller sentences, although with grammatical errors, typically intermediate fluency, where they're using more complex sentences, and advanced fluency, where they're using grade level academic language. All right. And as I mentioned, these stages, while they've been given different names by some different organizations and researchers, they've been relatively documented in the same format as they were in the 1980s. So this is the way that WIDA, which is an organization that does research on emergent bilingual students and that designs assessments for emergent bilinguals, they use these names for the levels, the different stages, and you can see that they're different. But they follow the similar structure: entering, beginning, developing, expanding, bridging, and then reaching is when the student is no longer considered an English learner or an emergent bilingual. Then they're just considered fully English proficient or bilingual at that point. All right, myth or fact number 2. It takes about a year for bilingual learners to develop grade level academic language proficiency in a new language. The answer to this one, myth. And if you were paying attention on the last slide, you may have noticed, let me go back for a moment, these time frames here about how long it takes to get to each stage: 0 to 6 months, then an additional 6 months, an additional year, an additional 2 years. So you may have had a sense that this was a myth, but let's talk about why. Using another construct, another important concept in the field of ESL is this idea of BICS versus KELP. Now, you read about this in the reading for this week, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time unpacking what these terms are. So in the 1980s and 1990s, Jim Cummins, who's a professor at the University of Toronto, was seeing that there were a lot of students who were identified for special education services that seemed to be disproportionately students who were learning English as a second language. And so he began to investigate this a little bit further and realized that a lot of students who were learning a new language at school, learning English as a new language at school, were being misidentified as having a learning disability, when in fact they just needed additional language supports. So it led him to develop this concept of language having kind of two different facets. He said language can be thought of in these two categories, as basic interpersonal communicative skills or social language, and cognitive academic language proficiency or academic language. And this is sometimes abbreviated as BICS and CALP. So essentially he was saying, students often develop social language fairly quickly, and they can go out on the playground and communicate with their peers. They can have casual conversations, but then when it comes to the language of schooling, these students seem to struggle, right? It's more challenging to read a social studies textbook or to conduct an experiment and write a science report. It's more challenging to write a persuasive essay than it is to have a conversation with somebody with social language. And so he said some students were being misidentified as having learning disabilities because they had this social language, but they didn't yet have the academic language at their grade level. And he argued that these things develop at different rates and that teachers need to know that. Now, there has been some pushback in recent years about the rigidity of these categories, arguing that there's a little bit more overlap between social language and academic language, and we also don't want to hold up academic language as the ideal language and discount the important role that social language plays. But most scholars will concede that there is a way that we use language at school, and there are ways that students are being asked to use language at school that is different than the ways that they're engaging socially with their peers. And that we need to recognize that it does take longer to acquire CALP or academic language. And just because that process is long doesn't mean that a student needs special education services. So just to provide an example of some of this distinction between social language and academic language. So the words that you see in the column on the left are words that are used more colloquially, more social language or BICS. Group, guess, watch, show, tell, write down. Those are all things that you could imagine a student saying to another student in a more social context or in a more informal context. Here's the academic version of each of those terms. Categorize, predict or hypothesize, observe, demonstrate, report, record. You can see that there's a different way that we're asking students to use language, even in just this simple example, when they're engaging in the different disciplinary practices at school. And this I wanted to share. This is the research that Jim Cummins ended up conducting, where he found that most students who were learning English as a new language were developing BICS, they were developing social language in English within 1 to 3 years. But he found that it took 5 to 7 years to get to grade level academic language proficiency. And that's with the proper supports put in place to be able to achieve grade level proficiency in academic language. And so this was important at the time and continues to be important because it helps us to see that just because a student is continuing to need supports for their academic language development doesn't mean they have a learning disability. We know that it takes a long time to develop grade level academic proficiency. So we should recognize that when we're thinking about the support students need and how long it's going to take for them to continue to need these supports to be successful. Okay, myth or fact number 3, learning a second language is just like learning a first language. The answer to this one, this is a bit of a trick question, is both myth and fact, and I will tell you why. All right, so for this one, I'm drawing from Stephen Krashen's distinction between learning versus acquisition. So this is what Krashen has argued about how we acquire a first language and how we learn or acquire a second language. Every person, barring some sort of serious cognitive disability, will be able to acquire a first language. Our brains are wired to learn language. Learning a first language is a largely subconscious process. We don't have to actively think about the fact that we're learning the language. We learn it through meaningful and contextualized language use, interacting with our family members and our friends at school. But even before we get to school, most of us will have this strong base in our first language because it is something we acquire naturally. We have what Chomsky calls a universal grammar in our minds, ready to take in features of whatever language we're exposed to. That's why children around the world learn the languages or language of their community, because you have the mental capacity, the mental facility to do that. It doesn't require that explicit instruction. Second language learning, or second language acquisition, on the other hand, is a little bit of both. It often is a very active and conscious process. We're recognizing that we're learning something that's different than our first language. It benefits from explicit instruction, but like first language acquisition, it emerges through meaningful and contextualized language use. So Stephen Krashen argued that we often treat L2 learning or second language learning as if it needed to be actively studied, that it had to be explicitly taught. And he was arguing that teachers should try to make it a little bit more like first language acquisition, that students should be given opportunities to meaningfully use the language. It should be contextualized, while also recognizing that there's some explicit instruction that is beneficial. So it's a little bit of both explicit learning and then that kind of natural acquisition of how we acquired our first language. Both approaches help us acquire a new language. So that's why it's a yes and a no, a myth and a fact for that statement. And I should note, before moving on to the next one, that there are many children around the world and here in our classrooms who are acquiring multiple languages simultaneously. So we often will refer to those students as simultaneous bilinguals rather than sequential bilinguals, meaning that they are developing multiple languages as their L1. So recognizing that L2 specifically refers to a language that is being learned after a first language foundation has been acquired, but that doesn't mean that there aren't plenty of students around the world, people around the world who acquire multiple languages as their first language as well. So something else to keep in mind. Okay, number 4, myth or fact. Knowledge and skills that students learn in their home language or languages can support their learning in a new language. The answer to this, fact. And hopefully you got this one. If you didn't, I will tell you why it is true. So for this one, I'm going to draw upon Jim Cummins' iceberg model of language interdependence. So Jim Cummins, who we talked about earlier, who came up with the concept of Bix and Kelp, used this metaphor to talk about the relationship between languages. He said, languages are like icebergs. When we're looking at an iceberg on the surface, it often looks like there are separate icebergs, right? So like this picture, you see 2 separate icebergs. Yet underneath the surface, as the Titanic unfortunately discovered, a lot of times pieces of ice that look like they're totally separate are actually interconnected. And there's a giant mass of ice underneath that is connecting what seems like disparate pieces of ice on the surface. So he used this metaphor to describe languages. He said 2 languages, language 1 and language 2, might look totally separate, and like from the surface level, they look completely different. And yet underneath the surface, languages have so much in common, often have more in common than the differences might suggest. And he called that the common underlying proficiency of languages. And so he argued that between languages then, cross-linguistic transfer can occur. If students are supported in learning something in their first language, or they know something in their first language, teachers can help connect to their first language to help them learn something in a second language because there's so much interconnection. Let me give you an example. If there's a student in your classroom who knows the word casa, and they understand that in Spanish, the letter that's represented as A makes an ah sound, that knowledge can transfer to their emergent English literacy skills in the word wand, which makes the same sound, ah, right? Casa, wand. And then they can learn that in English, because English is needlessly complicated, A makes other sounds as well, like the in umbrella, the A in table, and the A in ant. But this initial understanding of sound symbol correspondence for the letter A in Spanish transfers to English, and then they can add more knowledge to it. And you can imagine why it would be easier to learn something if if the knowledge is being connected to what you already know, right? A basic principle of good teaching is we connect to what students already know. The same thing applies with language. If we can connect to what they know in their first language, it's easier for them to learn it in a second language or to learn a second language. Here's another example of two languages that are more disparate, English and Arabic. A student in your classroom who enters perhaps an upper elementary school or middle school, and they already know how to write in Arabic. They know a lot about how language works, even if they don't yet know anything about English literacy. They understand directionality of print. They understand that we write moving from one direction to another, even though in Arabic, you write from right to left instead of left to right. They still understand that print follows directionality. They understand sound symbol correspondence. So while Arabic is a syllabary and the individual notations don't denote a single sound, they represent syllables, they still understand this idea about a symbol representing sounds, right? Or a symbol representing something that we're communicating. And they understand sentence structure or syntax. They know how to put together ideas in coherent sentences, which is certainly something that would be helpful as you're beginning to understand English syntax. So there's a lot that students are already bringing when they come to our classrooms that we shouldn't discard, but we should leverage and work to make connections to when we're supporting them in learning English as a new language. Okay, number 5, language mixing is a sign of confusion. The answer to this one is myth. It is not a sign of confusion if a student is drawing between or moving back and forth between different languages. Let's talk about why. What we've learned from research, and this is an area that I've done research in, so it's something I feel particularly passionate about, is that translanguaging, or kind of what looks like the mixing of languages, is actually just an authentic way of being bilingual. It's an authentic communicative practice that bilingual people and multilingual people engage in as they communicate. And I have some examples here of different purposes for why a student might translanguage or engage in translanguaging. The first 2 are from my own research, and then the other 2 are from others' research. So the first example was when I was in a 2nd grade classroom, and a student, this was a 2nd grade bilingual classroom, so all the students in the classroom were learning English and Spanish, and one student turned to me while they were doing a math activity where they had to measure different objects in the classroom, and he said, "Quiero medir un lápiz." It's much easier. He was saying, "I want to measure a pencil." It's much easier. And the purpose of switching to English in this case seemed to be to add emphasis to what he was saying, right? He could have said the whole statement in Spanish. He could have said the whole statement in English, but he started in Spanish, which was the language used for math, and then added some emphasis by saying that in English afterwards. In another math lesson, the students were in centers and they were playing with cards as they were working together. And one student looked around at his peers and he said, "¿Quién quiere shuffle this deck?" Who wants to shuffle the deck? So he's substituting some words and phrases, maybe because he didn't know the words in Spanish, but more likely because he's sitting at a table with bilingual children. He knows that everybody there speaks English and Spanish, and so he's drawing upon his whole linguistic repertoire to ask them a question. So students they'll use their whole repertoire if they know that everybody else at the table also will understand. These are also examples here from other research. You could ask papi and mami to see if you could come down. So using Spanish because it's the word that is usually used in that language. So this child doesn't call her mom, she says mami. So she's using the word in Spanish. And also to reinforce a request like, "Let's go, vámonos." So repeating something in the other language because you're reinforcing what you're trying to say. And we could go much further into this list. These are just 4 examples. There's many other purposes for why somebody would engage in translanguaging. And so something that's important to keep in mind when we think about bilingualism, and this connects to Jim Cummins' idea of the interdependence hypothesis, or that common underlying proficiency between languages, is that languages do not exist in the brain as 2 solitudes or as 2 separate entities. Rather, bilingual and multilingual people have one holistic repertoire from which they can draw to make meaning and to communicate. And this is important to keep in mind because it means when a student comes into our classroom, they always have access to their entire linguistic repertoire. They don't turn one side off so that they can focus in English. So as teachers, it's important to think about how you can make connections or help students make connections between their home language and English. Or if you're in a bilingual classroom, how you can help students make connections between the 2 instructional languages that they're learning, because they always bring their whole linguistic repertoire into the classroom. So a bilingual person is not a double monolingual. And a bilingual person has a single linguistic repertoire they draw upon as needed for different communicative situations. And this term translanguaging comes from Ofelia Garcia, and it's one that you'll hear about a few more times in this course as well. Okay, and last but not least, languages do not have equal status in society or in the classroom. And this, unfortunately, is a fact. And so I wanted to end with this because I want us to keep in mind that languages are not neutral entities that exist. We know that certain languages are privileged more than others, and that shapes both how students use language and how they feel about their home languages and the ways that they're taken up in classrooms. We live in a society where English is the de facto language of power. It's not an official language. Our country has no official language, but it's, I think, clear to anybody who is living in the United States that English is the language of power in this country. But students start to learn about language hierarchies at a young age. They start to realize which languages are valued and which aren't. So it's important that we don't ignore the fact that students are thinking about these things. In a mainstream classroom, so in kind of a general education English environment, students might not feel comfortable using their home language unless space is intentionally made for them. I often have teachers tell me that they don't tell their emergent bilingual students that they can't use their home languages, but the multilingual students just tend not to. And I often say, well, your students are aware that English is the language of power. It's the language that you're using and that other students are using. So if you want your students to actively bring their home languages into the classroom, which we know benefits their learning, right? We just talked about cross-linguistic transfer. We know it affirms their identity as multilingual learners. We have to be really intentional about making space for it, which includes stating it out loud. I want you to bring your home language here, and also designing activities or lessons that are framed around multilingual learners. So perhaps students are making bilingual dictionaries, or doing a bilingual writing project, or maybe you invite their parents in to teach the class something about the home language that student speaks. So you can be creative in thinking about how you might intentionally bring that student's home language into the classroom. For those of you who teach science or teach math, there are so many cognates between English and Spanish. So even creating a root word wall where you're identifying the cognates or identifying the roots, words that connect to different roots in science, like bio, which means life, and then looking at words in English and Spanish that connect or that use the root word bio, like biology, the study of life, and biología, which is a cognate. It shares the root and has a similar meaning and similar spelling in Spanish. So you can show how there are words that share roots and how understanding roots can help us to make connections across languages. And if you're in a bilingual classroom, the important thing to think about here is that it is important to protect spaces for minority language use and to continue to revisit issues of linguistic equity. So you want to think about, how do I create spaces for students to transfer what they know across languages, while also recognizing that I need to have protected spaces for the non-English language, whether that's Spanish or Portuguese or French, that it's important because those spaces easily become English spaces in a society where English is so dominant. All right. So in summary, what you've learned from today's myth or fact presentation, the first one is that learning a new language is a complex process that takes time. Just because a student hasn't mastered English in 2 years does not mean they have a learning disability. It can take 5 to 7 years to develop grade level academic proficiency. Language learners benefit from both explicit instruction and opportunities for meaningful and authentic language use. We know that both learning approaches that are focused on learning or more explicit instruction and approaches focused on acquisition or more authentic and meaningful use are both beneficial when students are learning a new language. The knowledge and skills that students know in a first language can transfer to a new language. So we need to think about how we can build spaces to help facilitate that transfer. Translanguaging is a normal feature of bilingual learning and bilingual communication. It's the way that bilingual people communicate in their everyday lives, not a sign of confusion. And all languages are not treated equally. Thus, teachers play a really important role as advocates for the use of students' home languages at school and in the classroom. I hope you learned something from this presentation and that it helped deepen your knowledge of some of the concepts that you read about for this week and that you've learned about in the TESOL BDL program. And I look forward to continuing to learn with you.